A few minutes after 9 a.m., on the cold, gloomy morning of February 25th, 1970, Oliver Steindecker gets off the subway and proceeds to wind his way through the bustling streets of New York City as he makes his way to work on East 69th Street. Finally arriving at his destination, he inserts his keys into the two ornate black doors. And then inside, he's greeted by the usual racks of in-progress canvases lining one side of the long hallway. He shouts his daily hello to his boss, the abstract expressionist painter Mark Rothko. But today, the painter doesn't answer him. This is odd. Rothko lived and worked in this space, so he should be here. Steindecker, wondering where he was, continues down the long hallway, past bruised chairs and tables, finally reaching Rothko's bed. It was empty, but ruffled. Normal. He then passes the doorway of a small bath and kitchen space, and he sees Mark Rothko, sprawled out on the floor near the sink, lying in a pool of his own blood. Panicked, Steindecker rushes back out the hallway and bangs on the door of Rothko's neighbor, Arthur Lidov. "Come quickly, I think Mr. Rothko is very sick," he shouts at Lidov before the two of them rush back into the studio. Lidov checks Rothko's pulse. Nothing. He's lying there in his pajamas, but interestingly, he's not wearing the glasses that he needs to see pretty much anything. Nearby rests a double-sided razor blade stained with blood and a Kleenex neatly wrapped around one edge. Lidov realizes what Rothko needs isn't a doctor, but the police. So at 9:35 a.m., the 19th Precinct is called to the scene. And just a few minutes before the police step onto the scene, Rothko's good friend and fellow artist, Theodoros Stamos, arrives. Perhaps out of shock, perhaps out of some sort of morbid fascination, Stamos asks Lidov if he would photograph the body. Lidov refuses, politely but firmly reminding Stamos that to do so would in fact be illegal. The police begin searching and studying the scene. Coffee is brewed, more calls are made. Just around 10 a.m., Rothko's lover, Rita Reinhardt, the widow of Rothko's contemporary, the abstract painter Ad Reinhardt, arrives in tow with Donald McKinney, a director at the Marlborough Gallery who represents Rothko. On the day Rothko was found dead, McKinney was supposed to meet with Rothko to go through his warehouse of paintings and select a number for an upcoming sale. Rothko was dreading this meeting, and he had told Rita as much the night before, so she agreed to accompany him for moral support. It eventually dawned on those in the studio that nobody had alerted Rothko's ex-wife and mother of his two children, Mel. And so at 11 a.m., she receives the news. Mel is calm, but underneath the surface lies a sense of bewilderment. Why had it taken this long for someone to tell her? Then, on February 26th, at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Home on the Upper East Side, Mark Rothko lies in state. This time, he has his glasses on. Someone must have found them lying in the studio and returned them to his face, where they always lay. The art world came in droves to pay their respects. Dealers, curators, collectors, and fellow artists were all in attendance, with Mel solemnly greeting each one of them. After the funeral, the immediate family made their way to Morton Levine's house for a quiet wake that he arranged. But before he could join the wake, Levine first had to meet with Stamos and with Rothko's longtime accountant, Bernard Reis. The three of them had been named by Rothko in his will as executors of his estate, and Reis wanted to introduce them to the lawyers he had hired to represent them, his longtime client Frank E. Carolson Sr. and his bland assistant Ernest Beale. Reis felt it imperative that all three men provide their signatures as soon as possible so that the will could be probated. As Reis explained, it would help protect the large inventory of paintings Rothko had left behind. This idea of protection would come to be the ultimate tragedy in Rothko's life. For those who knew Rothko, he was a fundamentally melancholy, dedicated, yet witty and opinionated man who held incredibly strong beliefs about the appropriate way to attend to his artworks and an innate desire to control everything around him. At the same time, he was a man with a deep-seated fear of abandonment. Protection of his life's work was of the utmost importance to him. And yet, in the 7 years following his death, all of the ways that the very people he had entrusted to protect his legacy had betrayed him would be laid bare for the whole world to see. This desire for protection became, tragically, the very thing that allowed for his exploitation. In the process, many of the inner workings of the art world would come to the surface for the first time, affecting forevermore how artists approached protecting their legacies. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. To understand why Rothko held the beliefs he did about his work and the proper way to care for it, it's important to first know a little bit about his background. Mark Rothko was born Marcus Rothkowitz on September 25, 1903, in what would become Latvia, but at the time was part of the Russian Pale of Settlement, the largest Jewish ghetto in the world. In 1910, Rothko's father, Jacob, immigrated to Portland, Oregon, and the rest of the family followed 3 years later. But only 7 months into Rothko's new life in a new country, and following 3 years of separation, his father passed away suddenly, leaving the rest of his family, who barely spoke English and were hardly settled, to try to hold themselves together. This sense of abandonment would root itself deep into Rothko's psyche, unconsciously affecting so many of the choices he would make as a grown man. But the family survived, and Rothko grew up to be barrel-chested, 5'11", with thick glasses over deeply myopic eyes. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but he had a presence, the kind of voice and physicality that commanded a room. After a few years at Yale, he dropped out to, quote-unquote, wander around, bum about, starve a bit. That romantic poverty wouldn't last, but the mythology of it would define how he saw himself for the rest of his life. Eventually, that wandering would find him in New York City, smack in the heart of a fundamental change in the art world ecosystem that saw its center shifting from Paris to New York as the New York School, otherwise known as the Abstract Expressionists, revolutionized art's potential. The New York School was a relatively tight-knit group, the seeds of which were sown through their work in the WPA during the Depression. But there was a distinct divide between them. Some, such as Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Franz Klein, belonged to the downtown faction of the group, concerned more with process than with content. The how as opposed to the why of painting. On the other side of the coin was the Uptown group, the group to which Rothko belonged, alongside painters such as Robert Motherwell, Barnett Newman, and Adolf Gottlieb. They had a greater focus on the theoretical, philosophical purpose of painting. But nevertheless, Rothko was a powerful presence in the group from the start. Robert Motherwell referred to him as, quote-unquote, a volcano of a man, and his early dealer Betty Parsons said his temperament was, quote, always Russian and melancholy, even when things were going his way, end quote. Rothko was also a very principled man, both in terms of how he lived his daily life and how he approached his career. He was known to weep at the injustices of others. He was likewise wary of any authority figure, often referring to dealers as parasites. He never really knew how to handle money, and he would insist on paying for everything in cash. He was also a heavy drinker, something that would increase in intensity as the years went on and which only served to exacerbate the depression he so clearly suffered from. Throughout the first decades of his career, up until the 1940s, Rothko made a pitiful living as an artist, and he had to supplement his income with a teaching job at Brooklyn College. Nevertheless, he was, in a way, proud of his poverty, almost to the point of martyrdom. He saw his lack of money as a kind of freedom from the strings that it so often comes with. This also meant that despite his growing reputation and real, if unappreciated, need for money, Rothko would not sell his works to just anybody. If you wanted a Rothko, first you had to pass his tests. He would often invite potential collectors to his studio to gauge their ability to truly grasp and appreciate his work. If you passed, the work was yours. If you didn't, the opportunity was gone forever. And then in the 1950s, things started to shift. The art market was starting to become what it is today. With post-war prosperity came new millionaires everywhere, and many of them saw the monetary potential of owning art, particularly contemporary art. So dealers proliferated to meet the demand. And the New York school was ground zero for this gold rush. Rothko himself was named in an article by Fortune magazine in December 1955 as one of the best buys in art, along with his friends Willem de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. And by the 1960s, his oil paintings were selling for a minimum of $36,000, which would be roughly $400,000 today. Yet his need for control over his paintings only increased alongside his reputation. He would obsessively oversee the installation of his exhibitions, insisting on specific lighting, specific spacing between works, specific wall colors. He hated lending his paintings to European shows because he couldn't supervise how they would be hung. What he wanted, what he needed, was for his paintings to stay together in groups, in museums where the public could experience them the way he intended. And in the spring of 1969, he told William Rubin, a curator at MoMA, that his dream was to keep as many groups of paintings permanently together as possible. He didn't want his legacy scattered. He wanted it protected. But the question was, who could he trust to help him do it? Enter Bernard J. Reis, an elderly and soft-spoken accountant with an affected English accent and a deep love for art and artists. So much so that his services went far beyond the mere crunching of numbers. He relished being invested in an artist's clothes, their diets, their love lives, their medical histories. No detail was too mundane. And on the financial side, Reis took care of everything. He would advise on how to stagger their incomes to avoid large tax bills. He would play the role of artistic Cupid by matching his struggling artist clients to his rich collector clients. He would draw up their wills, and even for the most successful, he would help them set up tax-exempt foundations. In return for this hard work, Reis would gladly accept a painting for his services. In other words, he made himself indispensable. And then he would slyly take advantage, because his generosity was not wholly altruistic. Those paintings he accepted in return for his services, he would often personally pick them out of an artist's studio, frequently taking paintings of great importance that were worth far more than the services he provided. And curiously, these gifts would not be listed on the tax returns he drew up on their behalf. When artists finally left his firm, they left angry, having uncovered faults in his financial advice and finding themselves tired of his constant presence in every aspect of their lives. But Mark Rothko never quite came to that realization. And in 1959, when Rothko had Reis draw up the first of his wills, Reis notably advised Rothko to leave out his wishes for the disposition of his paintings. Instead, he had them write them in a letter of intent to Herbert and Ilse Ferber, who he had selected at that time to be his executors, which said, quote, "Dear friends, we have just made wills which provide that in the case of our death and Kate's, you are to be the executors. The principal item in the estates, of course, is an inventory of paintings, and it is our wish that the pictures be sold as follows. A. The museum or individual who will acquire the largest number to be held in a single place should be given preference. B. To museums outside of New York City and in Europe which will acquire at least 6 paintings. C. To museums or individuals who will acquire at least 3 pictures. D. These conditions for distribution should be adhered to for a period of 5 years. With thanks, I am sincerely Mark Rothko and Mary Alice Rothko." As Reis's and Rothko's relationship matured, many in Rothko's circle began to become suspicious of the influence Reis had over his life. And those very same people would find themselves pushed out of Rothko's orbit under the direction of none other than Bernard Reis. Reis was isolating Rothko, cutting him off from anyone who might question what was happening. And he was about to introduce Rothko to someone who would make that isolation complete. Francis K. Lloyd was born Franz Kurt Levi near Vienna on July 13, 1911, to a family of antique dealers. In the 1930s, he claimed to have escaped Nazi persecution by trading, quote-unquote, all of his possessions in exchange for a passport and a visa. Although, in reality, he did manage to hang on to some paintings and smuggle them to Paris, where he fled for a time. In 1940, with France fallen, he escaped again to England, where he was interned in a refugee camp. It was in this camp that 2 important things occurred. The first was that Franz Kurt Levi changed his name to Francis Kenneth Lloyd because he wanted to associate himself with the financial power of Lloyd's of London. The second was his meeting Harry Fisher, who had been a rare book dealer in Vienna and possessed some knowledge of art. After the war, the 2 men opened an art gallery and bookstore across 2 floors of 17 Old Bond Street. They named it Marlborough, after the Duke. The timing was opportune. Money was hard to come by in post-war England, and in order to meet heavy tax burdens and refurbish estates, England's wealthiest were forced to sell off their painstakingly crafted collections of old masters, something that naturally they wanted to do as discreetly as possible. So Marlborough's reputation continued to grow in the old masters market over the intervening years, until 1960, when Lloyd had a fundamental realization. These works would not keep coming forever. But as we mentioned, the 1950s saw a great change in the market for contemporary art, and that led Lloyd to his second epiphany. He could use modern marketing techniques to create fierce demand for an artist's work by carefully releasing it into the market over long periods of time, giving collectors the impression that an artist's output was exceptional and rare. He cared little about the aesthetics of art, having once said, quote, "If it sells, it's art," but he knew for this to work, he needed to build a roster of artists who already came with a certain level of recognition, such as the artists of the New York School. In 1963, Lloyd knew it was time to stake his claim in New York, so he opened up a second branch of his gallery in the storied Fuller Building on 57th Street, the place to have a gallery at the time. Now all he had to do was find the artists. And who better to connect him to them than Bernard Reis, the man who represented all of their business interests? So Reis arranged a meeting at the St. Regis and brought 3 of his clients, Philip Guston, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko. Lloyd told them exactly what they wanted to hear: worldwide exposure, museum-quality catalogs, international exhibitions. Whatever they wanted, he would deliver. And he did deliver, just not for them. Because Lloyd's contracts weren't designed to help artists. They were designed to help Lloyd. He'd route purchases and sales through shell companies in Liechtenstein to dodge U.S. taxes. As insurance against losses, Lloyd went heavily into what he called the wholesale business, making outright bulk purchases of an artist's work, often 20 or more pieces at a time, at discounts of 40 or 50%, sometimes even more. He'd combine this with long-term exclusivity clauses, tying up an artist's production for years. And when possible, Lloyd also insisted on a survival clause, so that if the artist died before the contract ran out, he could maintain control. These methods gave him total control over an artist's output, which created an obvious conflict of interest. It was more profitable for Lloyd to sell the art he owned outright than the work still owned by the artist. And the fewer paintings he released to the market, the greater the demand, which meant the paintings he owned could just sit there, unsold, while their value climbed. All of the artists were swayed by this sweet talk, though. And so was Bernard Reis, who soon afterwards came on as Marlborough's accountant, while still working personally for the very artists Marlborough represented. Nevertheless, for a time, things between Marlborough and Rothko seemed to be going well. In 1963, he sold the gallery 15 paintings for $148,000 and let them represent him exclusively in Europe for 5 years with a decent commission structure, although he retained the right to sell artworks out of his New York studio. And he was given a well-received solo exhibition at the gallery in 1964. But by 1968, the situation had changed. That 1964 solo exhibition, it was the only one he received. So much for the promise of worldwide exposure that Lloyd had buttered him up with. And of those 15 paintings he'd sold to Marlborough, only 2 had been sold in Europe and 9 in New York. That was fine, except Rothko had already been doing pretty well for himself in New York. What he really wanted was help establishing himself in Europe, and 2 paintings in 4 years is hardly establishing yourself in Europe. What's more, Rothko didn't know how much Lloyd was actually selling his paintings for, whether he was sticking to the terms they'd outlined or not. So in 1968, he let his European exclusivity clause expire. He had no further need of Frank Lloyd. Or so he thought. Because in April of that year, everything changed. One balmy, beautiful New York spring day in April 1968, Rothko's day seemed like it would be relatively normal. But later in the evening, as the Rothkos were walking home from dinner, Rothko suddenly felt a piercing pain in the middle of his back as his legs went numb. Once they got home, Mel called Rothko's doctor, Dr. Albert Grokist, who suspected it was an aneurysm of the aorta. But before they left for the hospital, Mel also called Bernard Reis. And somehow, Reis got to the hospital before Mel, before Rothko, before even Dr. Grokist. He insisted on signing Rothko in himself, giving the staff all of Rothko's personal information. Mel didn't like it, but Reis had always been so helpful, so how could she say no? Looking back, this is the moment where everything changed. This is when Reis stopped being the helpful accountant and became something else, the person controlling access to Rothko. And Reis remained helpful in the immediate aftermath of the aneurysm. He visited Rothko every day for the 3 weeks he was in the hospital, bringing him soup and reading the newspaper. Rothko was touched by the kindness. But it still wasn't enough to stave off the damage this event would do to him. Physically, he recovered quite well. If he continued to take his medicine and cut down on his drinking and smoking, the doctors said, he would likely avoid anything like this from happening again. But mentally and emotionally, Rothko was never the same. The fears and anxieties he'd kept buried for years rose to the surface and overwhelmed him. He'd always been prone to bouts of depression, but now it became pervasive. Death seemed imminent. His health and reputation, always concerns, became obsessions. The self-belief that had nourished his genius curdled into tearful bouts of self-pity and guilt and doubt. And the mistrust that he'd always felt for the art world, a necessary instinct for self-preservation, deepened into full-blown paranoia. And Rothko, contrary to his doctor's orders, started drinking more to cope with his depression. His relationship with Mel completely deteriorated, so much so that he started thinking of separation, something he would follow through with on New Year's Day, 1969. The artist Helen Frankenthaler once noted the tragic air around Rothko that summer, calling it, quote, dreadful to watch, sad, angry-making, powerful and hopeless all at once, end quote. This brush with death forced Rothko to confront the logistics of his own mortality. Who would take care of his estate? Who would protect his legacy? On September 13th, 1968, he had Reis draw up a new will, and it was brutal. The yet-to-be-created Mark Rothko Foundation was now the primary beneficiary of Rothko's estate. Mel would only receive $250,000, the brownstone, and everything in it. And his 2 children, Kate and Christopher, they would receive nothing. They would only inherit whatever Mel had after she died. Rothko never wanted his children to be spoiled, so he probably saw this less as cruelty and more as protecting them from the corrupting influence of inherited wealth. And given the deteriorating relationship with Mel, Rothko also felt it no longer made sense to have her as his executor. Instead, he gave that honor to his fellow artist, Theodoros Stamos, his good friend, the anthropology professor Morton Levine, and Bernard Reis himself. Levine and his wife Anne-Marie were to become Christopher's guardians in the event both parents died. This wasn't the first will to mention the Mark Rothko Foundation. In an earlier version of the will drawn up in 1967, Rothko had also created it, naming Stamos, Levine, and Reis as directors, along with the art historian Robert Goldwater and MoMA curator William Rubin. But here's the thing. In the 1967 will, Rothko at least somewhat explained the foundation's purpose, an educational charity that would receive all but 48 of the paintings he left behind, with the goal of keeping groups of work together in museums. But now, in 1968, with his death feeling more imminent than ever, there was no explanation, no direction for the foundation beyond its mere existence. And with all that Rothko had going on in his life, he needed money. So when a young upstart dealer named Arnie Glimcher, owner of the Pace Gallery, asked Rothko if he'd be willing to sell him some paintings, Rothko said yes, but he needed $500,000 in cash. So Glimcher called up Ernst Beiler, the revered Swiss dealer, to help him drum up the money. Beiler flew to New York so he and Glimcher could meet with Rothko. The terms were decided, with the trio getting along swimmingly, and as the dealers left, Rothko said he just needed to run the deal by his accountant. When Glimcher and Beiler came back the following day to choose the paintings, Rothko's entire demeanor had changed. With tears in his eyes, Rothko told them, quote, The situation has changed. I'm terribly sorry. I can't do it. I like you very much, but it just isn't possible," end quote. The whole situation left them, Byler especially, wondering what sort of hold this accountant had over him. And then, still needing $500,000, and despite everything he'd said earlier about no longer needing Frank Lloyd, Rothko signed the contract that would seal his fate. In late February 1969, Rothko sold Lloyd another batch of paintings. On paper, the terms looked good. In reality, they gave Lloyd complete control. Rothko would get $1,050,000 for 21 oil paintings and 61 oils on paper, purchased through Marlborough's Liechtenstein headquarters. That was double what he would have gotten from Glimcher and Byler, plus he had the added bonus of not having to pay to mount many of the works, which had been sitting in storage for decades. But that's about where the benefits to Rothko ended. That $1,050,000, Rothko wasn't getting it all at once. It was going to be staggered over 10 years. And then it became over 14 years. Rothko only got $100,000 as a down payment. And the rest of the payments would come without any interest. Some speculated that part of that money would be deposited into a Swiss bank account in Rothko's name, which had some nice tax advantages. But we'll come back to those. Yet, the most interesting, and perhaps the most damning part of the deal was the exclusivity clause. Once again, Marlborough would become Rothko's exclusive agent, this time for the next 8 years. In return, he received a put clause. If Rothko chose to sell, Marlborough had to buy 4 paintings a year from him at 90% of retail market value. This would have let him share in the rising prices for his work, potentially bringing in $300,000 a year until 1977. And significantly, unlike his 1963 contract, this new one contained no survival clause, meaning it wouldn't be binding on his heirs and estate after he died. Or, at least, that's what Rothko thought. Because Marlborough would conveniently hide these terms, especially the put clause, from Rothko's executors, his children, and eventually the courts, for as long as they possibly could. But Rothko didn't see this as a bad deal. In fact, he told Theodoros Stamos he felt guilty for having pulled one over on Lloyd, which tells you everything you need to know about how effectively Lloyd and Reis had gotten into his head. Over the next year, as Rothko's mental and physical health deteriorated further, Rothko's fear of abandonment revealed itself in full force. He would call his friends for lunch at the last minute or just to talk at odd hours, and he'd obsess over the same topics repeatedly. His friend Stanley Kunitz said Rothko would call him in the middle of the night to agonize over wanting to buy an overcoat similar to Kunitz's. And when he finally bought one, at a discount, he returned it. Perhaps the one stable thing in his life was Bernard Reis. Rothko would see him every day, often multiple times a day. Reis had become something of a father figure to him. Rothko desperately needed the constant reassurance that Reis provided as his insecurities mounted. And the role of substitute father suited Reis perfectly. He could bask in Rothko's glory, which, in turn, gratified the artist. He would watch over Rothko's affairs, count his money, effectively dole out an allowance, choose his clothes, throw charming parties, approve or reject his friends, worry about his health, find him doctors. Whether the paternal aspects of their relationship ever occurred to either of them is unknown, but the dynamic was unmistakable to everyone around them. And all of these paranoid tendencies were made worse by the plethora of medications Rothko was taking. Pills that affected his memory, his eyesight, his depression, his stability. And Rothko did himself no favors by continuing to drink excessively, despite his doctor's pleas that he cut it down. And as mentioned, shortly before his death, Rothko was planning yet another sale of works to Marlborough. He had decided to set up trust funds for his kids after all. But he was also starting to suspect something was wrong. Several times during the last year of his life, Rothko stormed into Marlborough's office on 57th Street and demanded to see their price lists. Somehow he'd heard that their markup was much higher than they'd led him to believe. One Marlborough employee later reported that she was told to switch the prices while Rothko cooled his heels in another room. His suspicions were justified, but whether they were ever confirmed in his lifetime, we don't know. The night before he died, Rothko was having dinner with Rita, worrying incessantly about the appointment scheduled for the following day. Donald McKinney was supposed to come to Rothko's warehouse to pick out paintings for his new Marlborough deal. Not only did Rothko despise McKinney, but nobody had ever been to the warehouse before. This was his sacred space, where he stored the works he most wanted to protect. He had also confided these anxieties to his assistant, Oliver Steindecker, and in doing so, questioned Reis's motives for making all of this happen. Whose side was Bernard really on? But like Mel a year earlier at the hospital, Rothko didn't want to offend Reis. He was too afraid of confrontation. So he decided not to cancel the appointment or the deal. But the next morning, Oliver found him dead. And the looting had already begun. And now we are back where we began, but the story is far from over. When Rothko died, he left behind 798 paintings. That's an enormous body of work, worth millions, even by 1970 standards. He also left $141,441 in cash, treasury bills worth $191,000, and was owed more than $1.4 million, primarily by Marlborough's Liechtenstein headquarters. But by far, the most valuable asset was that reservoir of 800 paintings he'd so carefully protected throughout his life. And almost immediately, things started to get weird. Theodoros Stamos reportedly started acting differently towards the family the moment Rothko died. He began looking at Rothko's belongings as if they were his own possessions. The day after Mel picked up Christopher from school, who was only 6 years old at the time, and told him his father was dead, Stamos showed up at the brownstone with an affidavit. He wanted Mel to sign it, a document saying she wouldn't contest the will. She refused. Stamos later denied this ever happened, but during that same visit, he did convince her of something: to let Rothko be buried in the Stamos family plot in East Marion on Long Island's North Fork. Within a week of Rothko's death, Oliver Steindecker noticed something else. 3 paintings were missing from the studio. The policeman who'd been guarding the space said he'd noticed nothing. Mel brought it up at the will reading on March 6th. Reis's response? Probably wouldn't be helpful to report it to the police. After all, they'd been guarding the studio when the paintings disappeared. And curiously, the theft was never reported to insurance investigators. On March 6, 1970, the will was read. Present at the brownstone on 95th Street were Mel, her lawyer Gerald Dickler, their daughter Kate Rothko, 19 years old, Morton Levine, Theodoros Stamos, and Bernard Reis. Frank Carolson Sr. read the brief will. Reis laid out the numbers. The estate was valued at $5 million. There would be heavy taxes, maybe $500,000 or more. The paintings were worth over $2 million. And then he made his recommendations. Mel should file papers for her statutory widow's benefit, 1/3 of the estate tax-free. That would give her an inheritance of around $1.6 million. She should also file elections for the children against the foundation. Under New York law at the time, when a legacy is left to charity, children can elect to exercise their rights to half of the estate. Mel said she would think about it. Reis also recommended she not take the $250,000 she'd been given outright, but instead receive it in weekly installments of $250. Mel knew that this would make her dependent on Reis, but again, she didn't want to antagonize him. Meanwhile, Mel was calling William Rubin for advice. Should she file elections on the children's behalf? Rubin told her there was more than enough to go around. The most important work should be kept together with the estate, but he saw no reason the children shouldn't have their share of lesser paintings and works on paper. So Mel decided to elect against the estate for her children, but she didn't take the widow's exemption for herself. Probably because she thought she had enough money already within the Swiss bank accounts. Mel had started confiding in friends about these 2 secret-numbered Swiss bank accounts that Rothko had set up. One was in both of their names, and the other was countersignable by Bernard Reis. And Rothko had also mentioned these accounts to people. And in the spring of 1970, Mel kept trying to get information about the estate. She asked Levine if she could see slides of Rothko's paintings. He had an inferior set for himself, but told her to call Donald McKinney at Marlborough. When she called Levine again with another question about the estate, he told her to speak to Reis. And then on one evening that spring, walking to a dinner party with her friend Catherine Kuh, Mel confided, quote, "Catherine, I don't know what to do. I'm not sure, but I think there's some real hanky-panky going on with Mark's estate. It's all so tangled up and I don't know how to handle it." End quote. She considered breaking Rothko's will, arguing that he wasn't of sound mind and was unduly influenced by Reis when he signed it. But her lawyer, Gerald Dickler, advised against it. And besides, she didn't want to damage Rothko's reputation with notoriety about his irrational behavior in his final years. She told her friends she was thinking about finding a new lawyer, but she never got the chance. And in June 1970, Reis requested that the 32 paintings stored in the Brownstones' 4th-floor studio be turned over to Marlborough for quote-unquote storage and insurance purposes. Mel signed a letter agreeing, under the condition that they be kept separate from Marlborough's own inventory. And then, on August 26, 1970, 5 days before Christopher's 7th birthday, Mel died. Christopher was watching cartoons in the living room. Mel woke up, put on her bathrobe, had a cup of coffee from the electric pot near her bed, and crossed over to the bathroom. Christopher heard her gasp as she collapsed. He ran in, tried to rouse her, then ran downstairs to where Mel's boyfriend, Tony Arnell, was sleeping. Tony called an ambulance, but by the time they arrived, she was already dead. Kate Rothko was on vacation with friends in Vancouver, and by the time she got back to New York, Morton Levine had arranged everything. Christopher had been installed in a maid's bedroom on the 3rd floor of the Levine's house. Reis called Herbert Ferber, the Rothko's former friend, to tell him he was possibly Mel's executor and Kate's guardian. A few weeks after Mel's funeral, Kate made plans to meet friends at the Brownstones so she could pack up some things to take back to her house in Brooklyn. When she arrived, according to her friend Jackie Rice, quote, "They had rifled through the house like vultures, pulling out all the drawers, going through the cupboards and closets and scattering their contents," end quote. In early October 1970, Kate had a tearful meeting with the 3 executors at the Reis house. She asked if she could have her share of the inheritance and paintings. All 3 executors assured her she could have some paintings. And during that same meeting, Kate brought up Christopher's guardianship. She wanted to take her brother away from the Levines. She felt they were too strict and their life was too rigid. Levine consented to relinquish guardianship if a responsible alternative was suggested. So Kate called Mel's sister, Barbara Northrup, in Columbus, Ohio, and Barbara agreed to take Christopher as her legal ward. For a time, Kate believed the meeting had solved her problems. She soon realized it hadn't, and Mel's suspicions had been correct. Because while Kate was grieving her parents and trying to take care of her little brother, the executors were already making their move. Within 5 weeks of Rothko's death, Marlborough had taken over the lease of his studio and renamed it Marlborough Studio. Reis signed the lease and the rent check on behalf of Marlborough. He said it was to cut down expenses of the estate. And according to Donald McKinney, other than Lloyd refusing to enter the room where Rothko had died, Rothko wasn't on their minds at all when they went to figure out how to use the space for the gallery. And also, within 5 weeks of Rothko's death, Reis quietly became not only accountant, but director and secretary-treasurer of Marlborough, New York. It was never announced publicly. People knew he was connected to Marlborough, but it would be a long time before they understood exactly how deeply. On April 2nd, 1970, there was a meeting of the Mark Rothko Foundation at Reis's townhouse. Present were the 3 executors, Reis, Stamos, and Levine, and the 3 non-executor directors, Robert Goldwater, Morton Feldman, and Clinton Wilder. During the meeting, Wilder brought up Rothko's supposed last wish to reincorporate the foundation so it could aid elderly artists, which is something he had passively mentioned to Reis before. Then, on April 13th, 1970, according to Levine, the 3 executors met again at Reis's townhouse. Reis said the estate needed cash, so they had to, quote-unquote, hurry forward a deal with Marlborough. At this point, Levine claims he challenged the other 2 executors about their connections to Marlborough. He said Rothko had told him Stamos was negotiating his own contract there, and the art world knew Reis was connected with Marlborough, so Levine demanded court approval of any deal with them, because they could be accused of conflict of interest. And according to Levine, both Reis and Stamos lost their tempers. Stamos screamed, "Fuck you," at Levine, and Levine called Stamos a son of a bitch. He told Reis he was being, quote, arbitrary, high-handed, and intolerable, end quote. Reis and Stamos both denied this ever happened. Meanwhile, Lloyd was trying to sweeten Levine toward a deal. He offered to let him write a book on Rothko, which Levine refused because Rothko had chosen Robert Goldwater for that task. Then Lloyd offered to publish Levine's eulogy as a catalog preference. Levine said he could do that, but he wouldn't take any money for it. On April 30th, 1970, Reis wrote a 3-page memorandum to Stamos and Levine. He would come to regret it. In it, he listed Rothko's previous contracts with Marlborough, but he conveniently left out the parts that worked in Rothko's favor, like the fact that Marlborough wasn't allowed to represent him in the U.S., or the put clause that would have let him compel Marlborough to buy 4 paintings a year at market rate. Here's what the memo said, quote, "So as not to lose valuable time, I have permitted, with your consent, the photography of paintings for the show. I have also arranged with the Seidenberg Gallery, New York, for a proper appraisal of the pictures. Marlborough is anxious, and so am I, to consummate a proper deal for the sale of the paintings. I, on my part, do not want the estate to pay for any expenses of cataloging, photography, shipping, and publicity, or the large amount needed for restoration and mounting. It is therefore imperative that a contract be negotiated as soon as possible. Otherwise, the show will have to be canceled to the great detriment of the estate. It is most important with our large stock of paintings to publicize Rothko at this time in the European market. Because of my professional connection to Marlborough, New York, I do not want to participate in the negotiations, but do want to approve of any contract relating to the disposition of the paintings. I shall assist with all of my background, knowledge, and experience." End quote. Let's be clear about what this means. Reis is saying he won't participate in negotiations because of his conflict of interest, but he will approve any contract and assist with his background, knowledge, and experience. In other words, he's running the whole thing while pretending he's not. On May 4th, 1970, there was what Stamos called a philosophy meeting. The memo was read aloud, and they discussed how restoration of all the paintings would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They probably had $1 million in liabilities. So it was their duty as executors, they decided, to liquidate the estate. The negotiations began. The lawyer Frank Carlson would handle them, with Stamos and Levine joining him. Levine asked for an alternate proposal to be prepared, one where the 100 paintings that were part of the negotiation were consigned to Marlborough, not sold outright. And if that wasn't possible, the asking price should be $3 million. Nobody knows how they arrived at that $3 million figure. Levine said they based it on what Rothko had told them about his sales, but none of them bothered to corroborate this by looking at auction results or waiting for that independent appraisal from the Seidenberg Gallery Reis said he had requested. Lloyd laughed at that $3 million figure. He said he'd look at the slides one more time before making an offer. So after that meeting, at Reis's request, Carlson's firm prepared legal opinions. One concluded that Rothko's 1969 exclusivity agreement prevented the executors from entertaining any bid other than Marlborough's until 1977, even though there was no specific clause in the contract making it binding on his estate. And that put clause wasn't discussed at all. Another memo maintained that despite Reis's obvious conflict of interest as an officer and director of Marlborough, court approval of a deal wasn't necessary. Surrogate's court didn't like being asked for advice about projected business dealings, the firm claimed. Levine said his anxieties were, quote, mollified by the firm's legal-looking document, end quote. Which tells you everything you need to know about how out of his depth he was. In mid-May, Reis formally wrote to the Seidenberg Gallery requesting an appraisal of the 100 paintings. It was an odd choice. Daniel Seidenberg had never handled any Rothkos, but he had done deals with Marlborough over the years, deals for which Reis would have signed the checks. And just 4 months earlier, the three men and their wives had all stayed at Lloyd's house on Paradise Island in the Bahamas. Seidenberg appraised all 100 paintings for $750,000. Stamos called it dumb, and Levine called it ridiculous. It would later be revealed that the appraisal was typed on Bernard Reis's typewriter. On May 19, 1970, Stamos, Levine, and Carlson met with Lloyd again. Lloyd somehow already had a copy of the Seidenberg appraisal, which the executors had seen for the first time only minutes earlier. He countered their $3 million asking price with an offer of $800,000. When they didn't budge, Lloyd pulled this jack-in-the-box routine he was known for. He would leave the room to let them discuss, then keep popping back in with a series of quote-unquote final offers. They eventually settled on $1.8 million. And then Lloyd stated his terms. The deal would be with Marlborough AG in Liechtenstein. $200,000 would be paid upon signing, and the rest would be paid out in installments over the next 12 years, without interest. The deal was signed on May 20th, 1970. But that wasn't all. On the same day, the executors signed a second contract. This one consigned approximately 700 paintings to Marlborough, New York for 12 years. Marlborough would receive a 50% commission on each painting sold and 40% if they sold it to another dealer. And the minimum sale price was left to the gallery's discretion, quote, at the best price attainable, but not less than the appraised value of the estate, end quote. At the time the contract was signed, no inventory existed of the 700 paintings being turned over to Marlborough. A schedule to be prepared was mentioned in the contract, but until Donald McKinney prepared a list on June 24, 1971, the day before a crucial meeting, there was none. There was no way of checking what prices were obtained. Accounting to the estate was supposed to be mandatory every 6 months, but there wouldn't be one for another year. And insurance coverage was limited to $1 for all 700 paintings. For context, every other New York school estate contract with Marlborough had better terms. The Pollock estate, the Franz Klein estate, the William Baziodes estate, David Smith, Ad Reinhardt. Even other contracts Reis had worked on, like that Klein estate in 1965, were superior to this one. This was by any measure the worst deal Marlborough had ever offered an estate. And the executors signed it anyway. The three executors told nobody about these deals. Not the other non-executor directors of the Mark Rothko Foundation, not Mark's daughter Kate, not his son Christopher's guardian. It would be a year before anyone else learned what they'd done. And within months, Lloyd had already made almost $1 million on the sale of only 12 of the paintings he had purchased. So the looting was in full swing. In the fall of 1970, Robert Goldwater, the art historian Rothko had asked to be a part of the foundation and who he had asked to write a book about him, started getting suspicious. Reis told him that Rothko had changed his mind about the foundation's purpose right before he died. Now he only wanted it to help elderly artists, not to keep the paintings together. But this contradicted everything Rothko had told Goldwater, even close to when he died. On October 14, 1970, Goldwater formally asked to meet with Reis about the changes. And he also told MoMA curator William Rubin about his concerns. After hearing about them, Rubin confronted Reis, then sent a letter to all the executors and directors. It's worth quoting at length what he said. Quote, that Mark should have reversed himself in those last sick and distraught months is a tragedy for the public that would have gotten access to his work. The major works will now presumably be sold, many disappearing into private hands, and certainly never again to be made visible in the groupings in which Mark invested so much feeling. The many museums all over the world which would have been able to make Mark's work visible in this ideal way will be lucky if they can ever purchase a single picture. With important Rothkos now selling for over $80,000 each, small museums, university museums, and major national museums like those in Paris and Rome will not be able to get important Rothkos. If Mark could have dismissed his abiding concern about his work, it can only be explained as a function of his pervasive depression and despair, end quote. Rubin ended by saying that if they removed only the most important works to keep them publicly visible the way Mark wanted, there would still be plenty left to sell. But nevertheless, a few weeks later, the foundation's charter was changed. Rothko's dream of keeping his paintings together died with him. In late September 1971, Herbert Ferber, Mel's executor and Kate Rothko's guardian, told Kate that all of the paintings had been turned over to Marlborough. She was thunderstruck. She pressed Ferber to file a lawsuit against the executors and Marlborough. But Ferber hesitated. He knew Lloyd was ruthless. And as an artist himself, he had hoped to join the Marlborough stable. He wasn't on good terms with Reis, and he had had a falling out with Morton Levine. So he didn't want to battle against them. But Kate realized something. Her father, the one before the illness, before the paranoia, before Reis, had wept at the injustices of others. He'd revered art above all else. He'd loved his paintings. He wanted them kept together. Money had meant little to him. He didn't want her or Christopher to be extravagantly wealthy, just well off. So Kate would fight for the paintings, to give them the life her father had hoped for them, and against the blatant injustice and betrayal. She would turn 21 on December 30th of that year, so if her guardian didn't agree to sue, she could hire her own lawyers. But Ferber agreed. On November 8th, 1971, a petition was presented to Surrogate's Court. It asked the court to remove the 3 executors, stop Marlborough from further sales, have Marlborough pay back illicit profits, void the 2 contracts, and return any unsold paintings. It charged that the 3 executors had entered into a conspiracy with Marlborough to defraud the estate. When the news hit the New York Times, the art world exploded. People discussed it in whispers. And those who knew things that could have helped retreated. They didn't want to get involved. Most thought Lloyd would fight back harshly or settle before the trial. Either way, they thought Kate didn't stand a chance. The defense's first strategy was to delay. And then Kate got a powerful ally, Assistant Attorney General Gustav Harrow. Harrow had never heard of Mark Rothko when Kate's case was filed. But after investigating, he decided this one was worth pursuing. So he started interviewing important people in the art world, including Robert Goldwater. Goldwater told him everything. How Rothko's true intention for the foundation was to protect and show his art. How he'd questioned the executors about the change, about the letter he'd sent to Reis. That he hadn't known Reis was a Marlborough director, and that the executors had never told him about the contracts. By June 8th of 1972, Harrow had uncovered enough for the Attorney General to enter the suit on behalf of the public. The petition echoed Kate's charges, but added something crucial: that the respondents had acted in, quote, total disregard of the beneficiaries of the foundation and of the public interest in the preservation and proper exhibition of the paintings of one of the foremost artists of the period in the U.S., end quote. Within 10 days, Harrow had persuaded Kate's lawyer to seek a temporary restraining order against Marlborough from any further sales, and the judge ruled in their favor. But despite the court order, Lloyd had already started shipping batches of Rothkos out of the United States. Then came a crucial discovery. 13 paintings that Marlborough claimed to have sold appeared in 3 different places. First as sold to Marlborough for $248,000, then accounted for again with an extra $73,000 payment, then listed as consigned and sold to third parties. The accountants were confused. How could the same painting be sold multiple times? These papers contained the seeds of Frank Lloyd's destruction. What they revealed was simple. Lloyd was selling the same painting multiple times, running an art laundry to hide where they really went and how much he really made. The trial officially began on February 14th, 1974. It would last 89 days and produce almost 15,000 pages of transcript. Morton Levine testified first. He maintained his story about not knowing about the put clause and questioning Reis's and Stamos's conflicts of interest. But he was evasive about why he'd told Kate that she should receive a mixture of paintings and money when they knew they'd all been turned over to Lloyd for 12 years. After 2 weeks of testimony, he came off as fairly credible, but a terrible executor. Stamos took the stand next, wearing these bright orange, purple, and pink shirts. His testimony contradicted Levine on almost every point. He couldn't explain why Reis hadn't told them about rising Rothko prices, why Rothko had never let Lloyd into his studio, why his own Marlborough contracts were better than Rothko's, or why they'd kept the deal secret from Kate and the non-executor directors. His temper throughout all of it was never far below the surface. Expert testimony followed. Arnie Glimcher and Ben Heller testified about Rothko's importance and the estate's true value, which Heller estimated at $32 million by 1974, far more than the $1.8 million Marlborough had paid. In mid-April, Assistant Attorney General Harrow suffered a bleeding intestine and missed Frank Lloyd taking the stand, which was a shame because it was really something to see. When Frank Lloyd finally testified in June 1974, the courtroom filled with onlookers and reporters. He beamed beatifically from the witness chair, his face a tiny suntanned man in the moon above his well-tailored suit. Over 3 months of testimony, he displayed his theatrical persona, alternately charming and playing the injured party, nervously giggling, then indignantly frowning, impatient, then lecturing, cajoling and then flattering, then insulting and then condescending. He claimed he held no office in any Marlborough Gallery or shell company, though he admitted masterminding every facet of the organization. His galleries were just rented showrooms. The real business was handled in a tiny Liechtenstein office by an accountant named Franz Plutschau, who routed millions through constantly enlarging pyramids of paper-holding companies. Our business is like the jewelry business, Lloyd testified. We don't do anything in writing. There are very few written instructions. He blamed bad record-keeping on his employees. Important pages from the stockbook had been quote-unquote lost. During examination, it became clear that most of the 69 of the 100 consigned paintings Lloyd claimed to have sold had been laundered, washed through Liechtenstein holding companies at wholesale discounts, with Marlborough taking a 40% commission, leaving the estate with only a little over $700,000 of the $1.8 million they were promised. And at least 11 paintings had been profitably resold at double, triple, or 6 times the prices Marlborough had accounted for. Lloyd's attitude toward the court became one of lordly condescension. When speaking to a reporter, he compared himself to Nixon being pardoned in September 1974, declaring, quote, "I am a victim of American justice. Look how this crook is pardoned and see how I am treated by the same system of so-called justice," end quote. And just as Lloyd was concluding his defense, Assistant Attorney General Harrow received crucial intelligence. A 1949 Rothko that documents said had been sold to a Portuguese collector for $38,000 had actually been offered to the Australian National Museum for $92,000, 4 months after the alleged sale to the Portuguese collector. The painting had been supposedly one of Lloyd's legitimate transactions. It was the needle in the haystack, proof that Lloyd was operating an art laundry. But after Lloyd finished his 28 days of testimony, the trial ground to a halt in October 1974. Now it was up to the lawyers to write their briefs. The judge gave them months to prepare, postponing any decision well into 1975. In January of 1975, Lloyd distributed a 13-page defense of Marlborough's position to important clients, artists, and estate lawyers. Titled Unpublished Aspects of the Rothko Lawsuit, it claimed the executors and Lloyd were above reproach, that the contracts were fair, and that claims of illegitimate sales were based merely on innuendo. Art International published it in full, attributing it to a mysterious Augusta Dyke, who hadn't been present at any point in the trial, if she existed at all. Nevertheless, by 1975, Marlborough had lost many artists. They had lost Robert Motherwell, Philip Guston, the Franz Klein and David Smith estates. Rumors were swirling that the gallery would close its New York location. Everyone involved was struggling for money, except for Lloyd and maybe Reis. Kate had spent all of her father's bank accounts on legal fees. The foundation was owing hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Stamos sold his country house, and nobody had heard from Morton Levine. But when a friend ran into him, he didn't look well. mumbling something about how Kate Rothko ruined his life. But during the wait, witnesses were being examined by the New York District Attorney's Office to determine whether criminal laws had been violated, not just civil. And then, on December 18, 1975, Judge Midnick handed down his decision. Kate won, on every count. The judge ordered the removal of all 3 executors. He voided both contracts with Marlborough and ordered the return of the 658 unsold paintings. The executors were charged $9,252,000 in damages and fines. Marlborough and Lloyd were fined $3.3 million for violating the restraining order, a sum that was later increased to $3.8 million. Morton Levine's personal liability was $6.2 million, the highest because he'd been so candid about what a terrible executor he'd been. But the judge also said Levine could appeal his personal liability and that he would have preferred not to have fined him at all. As an incentive, the judge offered that payments could be decreased for each painting Marlborough returned to the estate. But everyone knew Lloyd wouldn't take that deal. Kate told the Times she was, quote, relieved and happy, end quote. But Lloyd had one more surprise. On Saturday, December 20th, 1975, just 2 days after the verdict, criminal lawyer Howard Eisenberg called Harrow with specific intelligence. Franz Plutschau would be arriving in Toronto the next day on Swiss Air Flight 170 from Zurich to arrange immediate shipment of art to avoid paying the Rothko judgment. Harrow and his team flew to Toronto in the middle of a snowstorm. They met with Ontario's official guardian, got a restraining order, posted detectives outside Marlborough's Canadian Gallery, and tracked down the warehouse. When they served Plutschau with an order, he was clearly nervous about being arrested. And the next morning, they raided the warehouse. Inside, among thousands of artworks by Lipschitz, Still, Klein, Pollock, Gottlieb, Kandinsky, Klee, they found 26 Rothkos. 12 of those were from the 100 Lloyd had bought and had been ordered to return just days earlier. 12 others were from the consignment contract. Customs documents revealed Lloyd had been quietly shipping art out of the United States before the trial, after the trial, and even at the time of the judge's decision. The National Trust of Canada took control of the assets until Lloyd put up a bond for the $7.3 million he owed. Eisenberg never revealed his source, but Harrow suspected it had to be someone inside Marlborough, possibly Bernard Reis, who had the most to lose if Lloyd's assets disappeared. After the Toronto raid, the art world's attitude noticeably changed. More artists left Marlborough in droves. Lee Krasner took Pollock's estate to Pace after 16 years with Marlborough. The Ad Reinhardt estate, the Gottlieb estate, and Richard Diebenkorn all left. And now there was the question of who would administer the Mark Rothko estate. On January 6, 1976, hearings began on Kate's petition to become administrator. Her aunt, Christopher's guardian, had agreed to back her as sole administrator. But Gerald Dickler, Mel's former lawyer who was now representing Kate's aunt, had other plans. He argued that Christopher's guardian should be co-administrator, claiming Kate was too young, too emotional, and didn't understand her brother's needs. He said Kate had lied to her aunt to get consent and was trying to prevent proper liquidation of Christopher's share. The problem was, Kate's aunt had actually sent a registered letter stating her permission, and when Dickler received it, he called her and told them he wouldn't file it, completely ignoring her wishes. Kate's lawyer, Edward Ross, countered that there was no conflict between Kate and her brother, that Kate was prudent and level-headed throughout, and perfectly capable of administering alone. Assistant Attorney General Harrow agreed. Kate wasn't emotional or vindictive. She was objective and capable. To clear things up, Kate's aunt hired a Columbus-based attorney, where she lived, to withdraw her objection and confirm she did want Kate as sole administrator. Eventually, the judge agreed and made Kate the sole administrator of her father's estate. Again, Kate's victory hit the front pages. Dealers, museum directors, and curators who'd refused to quote-unquote get involved during the lawsuit now swarmed to pay court to her. But winning was just the beginning. Now Kate had to figure out what to do with an estate worth tens of millions, while still millions in debt from legal fees. In May 1978, Kate graduated from medical school. She and her husband Ilya continued to live with Christopher in a modest 2-story frame house in residential Baltimore, dealing with both professional obligations and estate obligations. Frank Lloyd, after losing all of his appeals, eventually paid all of the fines and damages meted out collectively against Marlborough and the executors. To obtain further credit against those fines, he returned in January 1978 another batch of Rothkos he had previously claimed had been legitimately sold and were irretrievable. Bernard Reis filed for bankruptcy shortly after Lloyd paid those fines, and he continued selling art from his collection until he died on December 3, 1978. Theodoros Stamos died on February 2, 1997, in Greece at the age of 74. His reputation, which had never been particularly strong to begin with, never recovered from the scandal. In March 1977, District Attorney Robert Morgenthau announced that a New York grand jury had indicted Frank Lloyd on 3 counts of tampering with physical evidence. In 1983, Lloyd finally returned to Manhattan to stand trial. He was convicted by a jury of tampering with evidence, and he could have served up to 4 years in prison. But instead, he was ordered to establish a scholarship fund and present a series of art lectures and private showings for New York City high school students. Through his lawyer, Lloyd asserted his innocence but acknowledged the sentence as, quote, a fair, humane, and socially useful conclusion to the Rothko litigation, end quote. Lloyd died on April 8, 1998, in Nassau at the age of 86. His reputation never really recovered. In 1985, he told The Times, quote, from a perspective of experience and hindsight, I regret some of my actions, and if I had to do it over again, there are things I would do differently. However, I believe deeply that I contributed substantially to the successful careers of many European and American artists, in particular Mark Rothko, and was instrumental in bringing to public attention the great talent that I saw in his work, end quote. The Pace Gallery, run by Arnie Glimcher, became the exclusive representative of the Rothko estate and remains so today. Marlborough Gallery eventually refound its footing under the direction of Lloyd's son Gilbert and his nephew Pierre Levi, becoming a major representative of Spanish and South American artists like Paula Rego and Fernando Botero. But it officially closed in June 2024 after almost 80 years in operation, following years of internal family warfare, financial losses, and an inability to keep up with the times. And what of Rothko's legacy? Many of the paintings sold had vanished, but the paintings that were returned to the estate were exhibited in a Rothko retrospective that was mounted at the Guggenheim in 1978 and which later traveled across the country. And the future safety of his work was newly assured. True to his promise during the administrator hearings, Harrow set about restructuring the Mark Rothko Foundation. Reis and Stamos resigned as officers and directors in January 1976. Without a judicial mandate, but with the persuasive power of his position, Harrow interviewed the remaining directors, and they agreed to resign when their terms expired in May 1976, voting in a new slate of directors that included Dorothy Miller, Thomas Messer, Gifford Phillips, Emily Rao Politzer, Donald Blinken, Jack Tworkov, and William Scharf. But here's what the whole story is really kind of about. It's not about Kate winning or Lloyd losing. It's about the fundamental tragedy at the heart of Mark Rothko's life. It wasn't Rothko's paranoia that caused his death, nor did paranoia destroy his ambitions for his creations. His deepest suspicions about the art world were warranted, although they were unsubstantiated during his lifetime. What so greatly contributed to his destruction was the greed of others for the profit from the merchandising of his immensely valuable paintings. There were very real pressures on him that February morning he died. Marlborough was about to violate the sanctuary of the storage places containing his masterpieces. The realization that he had misplaced his trust, that he had been seduced by Swiss bank accounts, that Reis was working on Marlborough's behalf, all of this must have deepened his anguish and his helpless despair. The knowledge that he had allowed all of this to flaw his judgment could only have added to the torture. And in his drugged and weakened state, he could have seen no way to protect either himself or his work. What the entrepreneurs aimed to wrest from him when he was alive became easy plunder after his death. And it's so tragic because Rothko spent his entire life trying to protect his paintings from becoming commodities. But every single mechanism he put in place to protect his legacy became the weapon used against him. In a way, protection became exploitation, trust became betrayal, and the systems designed to safeguard artists can also be the very systems that make them vulnerable. And very little has changed. The Rothko trial revealed the intricacies of art dealing for the first time, the specific dangers and temptations inherent in the art world. It is a small world where vast sums of money frequently change hands, and secrecy and discretion are the hallmarks of many deals, so that rigging is not only often expected, but slightly condoned. And the mere fact that it took a costly civil court battle with armies of attorneys to expose these scandalous transactions shows how immune the art world is to normal business ethics. And there continues to be a general disinclination to face what the Rothko trial revealed about the art world and some of its prominent members. Artists are still vulnerable to exactly these kinds of betrayals, and opacity is still the ultimate business model. To be clear, most people in the art world do not operate with nearly the amount of greed that Frank Lloyd did, but trust can still be the first thing that greed exploits in the art world, and the mechanisms for protecting artists can still be compromised. Kate's fight shows that it's possible to win, but at an enormous cost. And in many ways, the system hasn't changed because the system doesn't want to change. Rothko died, probably driven in part by despair over losing control. Mel died possibly from the stress of it all. Kate lost her parents at 19 and spent her inheritance fighting for justice. Christopher lost his childhood. And the paintings, the things Rothko loved the most, were scattered and sold and lost. But because Kate fought, hundreds of Rothko's paintings are now in museums where he wanted them to be. Because she fought, the art world, if only briefly, had to confront its own corruption. As an artist, Mark Rothko's longing for immortality has been fulfilled. But he also achieved lasting fame on another level, as the hero and victim of a modern morality tale. It's a role Rothko probably would have welcomed in the time before his principles were compromised by success. And what would real protection for artists look like? We don't necessarily have an easy answer. But recognizing that the current systems are designed to be exploited is a good first step. The art world loves to present itself as being about beauty and transcendence and the eternal human spirit, and for many it is, but for some it is also about money, power, and control. Rothko saw this, and he feared it, and he tried to protect himself from it. But in the end, fear itself became the trap. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or a moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.